While payments might seem like a simple term, it's actually a complicated space. I'm joined by Nathan Hilt from Protiviti to demystify the myths behind payments. So Nathan, welcome.
Thank you.
So to start off, I'd love to talk trends in the payment space right now. What are you seeing?
I think the main trend that I'm seeing is that payments is getting more complex. I think that especially at shows like this, you see the fintech players, you see the financial institutions, you see all the established networks and processors. They're actually making something that in the past, when I would hand you $5 for a transaction or between a merchant, which was fairly simple and straightforward, there was a lot of complexities behind it to make that transaction, but the actual movement of value was fairly simple. Now you have 4 intermediaries and you have 5 different processes and there's systems. Like, I think if my wife came to an event like this, which is just a normal consumer, she would be mind-boggled at the complexity and all of the jargon that goes on in the payment space today. So I think the trend is it's more complex and we're making something that was typically simple into something that's very, very complex. And then the second piece is, which is somewhat of a concern, is that we have more people involved. So a theme here is around inclusion and getting more people involved. But again, you're taking a group of people that maybe were on the fringe or that were underbanked or underserved, and you're giving something that is massively complex on the back end. So maybe the user experience feels nice on an app, but having someone explain what is moving, what's real time, what's not, who's doing an authentication, is there AML, is that route through a system, is AI, it's crazy. Yes, so I think the trend is we're moving to more complex versus simpler, and that we're involving more people that are not going to understand all that's going on behind the scenes.
So ultimately, what's the impact then of those trends?
It kind of scares me a little bit. And so when I think about this idea of whether it's an enterprise or operational resiliency or things in which we have to have redundancy, we've created so much complexity in here that the idea of a transaction having one, if not multiple places where it can fail, where you can have something interacting with it or decline, etc., because of all this complexity, it just makes the fact that some of these transactions work like amazing things. And the reality is we should be working towards simplicity, and not just the user experience, but actually the process in order to move money should be something that could be easily explained, and we're not doing that. So I think the impact is that those people who don't understand are going to be dependent on others to explain it to them. And when something goes wrong, the entities in which they're trusting, so if that is a tech company because they're offering the service, if it's a mobile operator because they're providing the interface, if it's a card network, if it's a bank, they're going to be relying on explaining something that, again, was once simple, now is complex, and they're not really going to understand what the impact is.
And here at Money 2020, how have you seen the event in that landscape ultimately change in terms of payments?
Well, I see more and more people. So every time that I come here, I'm like, wow, there are so many people in payments and there's so much complexity and we're adding so many participants, which I'm a big fan of the digital aspect and making things seamless and frictionless, etc. But again, it just makes me think, how is this changing in a way that's going to make that point of interaction a simpler process? And part of what here is not here is we have all of these participants that are growing, and yet what's not represented in conferences like this are the actual merchants. The places in which these transactions are happening they're not here. So we've abstracted the payment process and everything goes on behind the scenes, and then that point in which the actual I hand you $5 or you hand that to a merchant, we're not taking that in consideration. So I think if we are going to have a holistic view, you have to have all participants in the conversation, and that's not happening, even though there's way more people here than ever before, and there's way more complexity.
So what's ultimately not being discussed in this space then?
And I think that's the exact piece, which is, are all the participants in the value chain really being represented? Because we don't really have a big consumer base here, and everyone that's here that's talking about all this technical jargon, they're payment people. So again, the people that are using it that are outside of this conference, they're not actually being represented here, I think, in a good way, or their industry groups versus the actual consumer. And then I also think the fact that merchants aren't here, we're not really getting that perspective, even though it's still massively complex. And then I think there are some topics that are just being, high level addressed, and the reality is things like whether it's Libra or some cryptocurrency or blockchain based technology solution, we're not addressing the fact that in the US system we still only have 2 rails. Where is the 3rd rail? Why is that not being discussed? Why is that not something that we're all concerned about? That the 2 rails, yes, they're getting faster, yes, there's more data, but shouldn't we have more? Like, why are we relying upon processes and systems that are 50 years old for something that, again, we're adding complexity, there has more solution, but we're not adding more rails, and no one's competing on the rails. We're all competing at the fringe. So I think those pieces should be discussed, and they should be discussed in a meaningful way. And then the last piece is that there are things that are happening out in the world of consumers, like cannabis. That is reality. It is legal in some states. There is a lot of legal jurisdiction and regulation that has to be rationalized, but no one's really talking about it in a meaningful way. And to me, we've taken something, again, I hand $5 in cash, and then we add all this complexity, and yet this industry, no, we're going to keep that as cash. It just
it's
seems
very disjointed still.
Yes,
right.
exactly. Like, oh, for this type of transaction, we're going to have all this complexity and automation and a seamless experience. But no, for these other things where the same consumer is doing what would be a perfectly legal transaction, we're going to go back in time and make it all cash-based. And all cash-based through much of the value chain, which is, again, what's the purpose of digital payments is to reduce complexity, reduce friction, to have less pain points, and yet for this one thing, we're not really addressing how should that change or what should be done.
Well, it's probably comes down to folks are a little afraid still to touch the topic because of all those regulations that still need to be in place, because no one's really cracked the code yet on security and payment structure for it.
Right, I agree. Yet that's what these conferences are for, is to have people that are experts in solving these things, talking about them. Because the reality is we've proven that having cash-based payment processing, although it is simple, it doesn't have the fraud detection, it doesn't have the regulation, all of the security that goes along with it. So again, if we add complexity but we add value within it, maybe that's a trade-off. But if we just force someone into a cash-based system, for whatever the reason, it just feels like we're going back in time.
Absolutely. So in your opinion, what is the biggest misconception in payments right now?
That we're making things less complex. We are definitely making things more complex, and we're not consistent. So
I think
maybe
that's the key right there, is consistency. I think you hit it.
Correct. And so maybe the idea is that we're still, in the early stages of what really, truly transformed end-to-end digital payments are. So maybe that's understandable, and you still have participants in there. But if someone comes and says that again, demystifying payments, no. We need like a sorcerer to kind of explain all this stuff, because the average person doesn't really understand what is going on behind the scenes.
I'm sure most folks aren't even sure what's going on at the conference sometimes, because it is so fragmented.
It is.
I can imagine it's very frustrating as an attendee to kind of understand where you need to be putting your energy and time into when you come to these, because of those reasons that you mentioned.
That is, yes.
So hopefully in the near future a solution presents itself and we go back to that more simplistic approach to payments. But Nathan, always a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you for your insights.
Thank you very much.
From Medici Studio, I'm Shannon Rossick.